The village of Omoa sat quietly between two hills in Anambra State, where the harmattan winds carried red dust through the compound every dry season, and the smell of palm oil stew lived permanently in the air. It was the kind of place where everybody knew when your mother bought a new wrapper at the market, where children still played 10-10 under the mango tree until darkness forced them inside, where the women gathered at the borehole each morning and settled the affairs of the world before breakfast. In this village, in a compound with a rusty zinc roof and a small garden where Chidima Okofor grew her ugu and tomatoes, two sisters were learning what it meant to love someone more than yourself, though neither of them had words for it yet. Adora was the kind of child who seemed born responsible. Even at 7 years old, when other children were still learning to tie their wrappers properly, she was the one braiding her younger sister's hair into neat cornrows before school, checking that Ngozi's uniform was clean, making sure she had eaten before they walked the dusty path to the primary school. By the time she was 18, tall and striking with long silky hair that her mother adorned with thin gold ornaments saved from better times, she had perfected the art of anticipating need. She woke before the compound stirred, fetched water before anyone asked, ground pepper while her mother was still stretching the sleep from her bones. Ngozi, 3 years younger, softer in all the ways Adora was sharp, would wake to find her school bag already packed, her breakfast already wrapped in foil, her sister already moving on to the next task. Ada, you will work yourself to death one day, Ngozi would say, still rubbing sleep from her eyes, and Adora would smile that particular smile, the one that said, "This is not work when it's for you," and tell her to hurry before they were late. Their father, Chukwuemeka Okofor, was a man of few words and steady hands. He repaired motorcycles and small engines on a patch of land near the main road, and people brought their broken things to him because he had a reputation for honesty and because he never charged more than was fair. He came home each evening smelling of engine grease and sweat, his fingers permanently darkened from work, but there was always tenderness in the way he called his daughters "my flowers" and asked about their day. Their mother, Chidima, sold garden eggs and pepper in the market 3 days a week and sang Igbo hymns while she cooked, old songs about God's faithfulness that seemed to make the soup taste better. She had a way of stretching small money into full meals, of turning yesterday's leftovers into today's feast, of making her daughters feel rich even when the cash box was nearly empty. It was not wealth, but it was wholeness. The girls had never known hunger. They had never known silence in a house that should have had laughter. They had never known the particular coldness that comes when love leaves a place. That April, the rains came too hard and too fast. The harmattan season had left the ground cracked and stubborn, unable to drink quickly enough when the water finally arrived. And the Enugu Road, already old, already neglected by a government that barely remembered villages like Omoa existed, became a river of red mud. The bridge was wooden, built decades ago by men who are now grandfathers or ghosts, and it groaned under the weight of each vehicle that passed. Chukwuemeka had crossed it 1,000 times on his motorcycle, carrying parts to customers in neighboring villages, and he must have felt it shudder that afternoon, must have heard the crack of old wood giving way beneath him, must have had one terrible moment of understanding before the bridge and the man and the motorcycle all went into the rushing water below. They found him 3 hours later, caught against the bank, still holding the handlebars. Chidima received the news while she was pounding yam for dinner. She dropped the pestle, walked into her bedroom, lay down on the mat where she had slept beside her husband for 23 years and closed her eyes. She did not scream, she did not wail. She simply became very quiet, very still, as though she were listening for something only she could hear. She lasted 43 days. Adora counted them, each one marked by the way her mother grew smaller, lighter, more translucent, like a person slowly becoming a photograph of herself. The doctor in the clinic said it was heart failure, that grief could do that sometimes, could stop a heart that had been perfectly healthy simply because it had decided it no longer wished to beat without its other half. But Adora knew it was not a medical thing. It was a decision. Her mother had looked at a world without Chukwuemeka in it and chosen, quietly and without drama, not to stay. The funeral was held on a Saturday. Ngozi, 15 and drowning, stood beside her sister and sobbed into Adora's shoulder. And Adora, 18 years old, orphaned, terrified, held her and did not cry because one of them had to remain standing. After the guests left and the compound was empty again, after the plates had been washed and the leftover rice divided among neighbors, Adora sat outside under the stars and finally let herself feel it. The enormous, crushing weight of being the only thing standing between her sister and a world that did not care whether they survived it. She did not cry even then. She simply looked up at the sky and spoke to her mother in a whisper. "Mama, I don't know how to do this, but I will not let her fall. I promise you, I will not let her fall." They moved into Mama Nkechi's compound the following week. Their grandmother was old, older than the Hamatan, Ngozi used to joke, with skin like paper and hands that shook when she tried to carry water. The house was smaller than the one they'd left behind, with walls that had faded to a sad grey and a roof that leaked in 3 places when the rain came. Mama Nkechi had almost nothing. A small pension from her late husband's time as a clerk, a patch of land that yielded less each year, the kindness of neighbors who remembered when she had more and helped her now that she had less. She loved her granddaughters fiercely, but love could not pay school fees or buy textbooks or put protein in the soup more than once a week. Adora understood the mathematics of it within days. There was enough for Ngozi to continue school, or enough for Adora to continue school, but not enough for both. There was no moment of debate, no family meeting to discuss options. Adora simply made the decision the way you make a decision to breathe. On Sunday night, she took her school uniform, the one her mother had washed and ironed every week, the one she'd worn with such pride, and folded it neatly into the bottom of her trunk. On Monday morning, she told Ngozi to get ready for school, that everything was fine, that she'd walk her to the gate. Ngozi looked at her with eyes that already understood, but couldn't yet accept. "What about you, Ada? What about your studies?" Adora tucked a loose braid behind her sister's ear, the way her mother used to do, and smiled. "I'm finished with school. I have other work to do now, but you're going to study. You're going to pass your exams. You're going to make Mama and Papa proud. That's all I need from you." Ngozi opened her mouth to argue, to protest, to say that it wasn't fair, but Adora had already turned away, already walking back to the compound, already carrying the weight that would bow her back for the next 4 years. Before we continue, do tell me where you are watching from. If you are from TikTok, the full story is already on YouTube. Enjoy! Adora began with her hands because that was all she had left to give. At 4 in the morning, when Omoa was still wrapped in the particular darkness that comes just before dawn, she would wake on her mat in the corner of Mama Nkechi's sitting room and feel her way to the back of the compound where the mortar waited. The wooden pestle was heavy, hewn from Iroko wood by someone's grandfather, smoothed by decades of women's palms, and the first few weeks her shoulders screamed with each lift and fall. But Adora had learned something about pain. If you welcomed it, if you made space for it in your body and kept moving anyway, eventually it transformed into something else. Not strength exactly, more like stubbornness made physical. She pounded cassava into fufu while the compound slept, her arms rising and falling in a rhythm that became her new prayer.
And by the time the first light touched the tops of the 2 hills that cradled Omoa, she had already wrapped 20 portions in fresh banana leaves, each one tied with raffia string, each one representing 15 naira that would go into the old biscuit tin she kept hidden under her mat. The roadside became her shop. She set up on a wooden crate near the junction where the Onitsha road met the path to the farming settlements, and she sold to whoever passed. Farmers heading to their plots with hoes balanced on shoulders, women going to early market, truck drivers making the long haul between cities who stopped for something that reminded them of their mother's cooking. The profit was razor thin. After buying cassava, after the kerosene for the stove, after setting aside Mama Nkechi's small contribution to the household, Adora was left with maybe 800 naira on a good day, 500 on a bad one. She kept a notebook, a small exercise book that Ngozi had left behind from primary school, and she recorded every transaction with the seriousness of a bank accountant. Cassava, 200, kerosene, 150, sales, 1200, profit, 850, Ngozi's school fees balance, 12,300. The numbers were a map leading to a destination she could barely see but refused to stop walking toward. Some evenings she would sit with that notebook under Mama Nkechi's dim kerosene lamp, her finger tracing down the columns, doing the mathematics of survival. If she saved this much each week, Ngozi could stay in school for 3 more months. If she found 1 more customer, maybe 4 months. If she worked Sundays, maybe she could buy Ngozi new sandals before the rainy season made the old ones completely unwearable. The first thing she sold was her mother's silver earrings. They were small, delicate things, not real silver, probably, but silver-colored metal that Chidinma had loved and worn every Sunday to church. Adora held them in her palm for a long time before she walked to the jewelry trader in the market, feeling their weight, remembering how they had caught the light when her mother laughed. The trader offered her 1,500 naira. She negotiated up to 2,000, walked home with the money folded carefully in her wrapper, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to sit behind Mama Nkechi's house and cry silently into her hands. Then she washed her face, counted the money again, and added it to the tin. The good wrapper came next, the expensive Ankara print Chidinma had been saving for important ceremonies, the one with the gold threading that made it shimmer. 3,000 naira. Then her secondary school textbooks, the ones she had covered carefully in brown paper and labeled with her name in neat handwriting. 500 naira for all of them, sold to a provision seller who would resell them to younger students. Each sale felt like a small amputation, like she was cutting pieces off herself and handing them to strangers. But Adora had discovered something about sacrifice. Once you start, stopping becomes impossible. Not because you are noble, but because you've already given too much to turn back now.
Mama Nkechi watched her granddaughter disappear into work, the way you watch a person sink into deep water. The old woman would sit in the doorway of the compound, shelling melon seeds or folding laundry, and she would see Adora return each evening. Back bent, feet dusty, hands cracked from constant washing and pounding, skin growing darker from long hours in the sun. Sometimes Adora came home so tired she could barely eat the food placed before her, but she always asked, "Mama Nkechi, how much do we need for rice this week? How much for kerosene?" As though her own hunger was not worth mentioning. The old woman tried once to tell her to slow down, to rest, to think about herself. Adora had smiled, that same patient smile she'd been giving since she was a child, and said, "Mama, I'm fine. This is not suffering. This is just work." But Mama Nkechi had lived long enough to know that sometimes the two things were exactly the same, and the only difference was what a person chose to call it. She prayed for her granddaughter every night, old prayers in Igbo that asked God to remember the girl who was killing herself slowly so that her sister could live. By the time Ngozi came home for the Christmas holiday that first year, Adora had added 2 more jobs to her schedule. She washed clothes for 3 families now, a teacher's family, a retired military man's household, and the wife of the local government chairman who had 7 children and impossibly high standards. Adora would wake even earlier than before, pound her fufu in the dark, sell until midday, then spend her afternoons washing and starching and ironing under the hot sun in people's backyards. The work destroyed her hands. The constant immersion in soap and water made her palms crack and bleed. Her fingernails, once neat and carefully kept, became ragged. Her back developed a permanent ache that sometimes woke her in the night. When Ngozi stepped off the bus from school that December, glowing with good grades and stories about her teachers,
She took one look at her sister and burst into tears. Adora was thinner, not dramatically so, but enough that her cheekbones were sharper. Her wrapper hung looser at her waist. Her skin had darkened several shades from the sun, and her hands, which Ngozi grabbed and held up to the light, looked like they belonged to a woman twice her age. Ada, what is happening to you? Ngozi asked, crying openly now, not caring who saw. They were standing in Mama Nkechi's compound, the afternoon sun beating down, and Adora tried to pull her hands away, embarrassed. It's nothing, I'm fine. Tell me about your exams. But Ngozi wouldn't let go. She held those ruined hands and cried harder, and Adora, who never cried, who had locked her tears away somewhere deep and unreachable, felt something crack open in her chest. She pulled Ngozi close and held her while she sobbed, patting her back the way their mother used to do, whispering, "Shh, it's okay," even though both of them knew it wasn't. When Ngozi finally pulled away, wiping her face with the back of her hand, she looked at her sister with an expression that was part guilt, part determination, part something else that Adora couldn't quite name. Ada, I'm going to make this worth it. I swear to you. I'm going to study so hard. I'm going to make you proud. I'm going to make Mama and Papa proud. Everything you're doing, I'm going to make it mean something. Adora smiled then, a real smile, the first one in months that reached her eyes. I know you will. That's why I'm doing it. She tucked one of Ngozi's braids behind her ear, the gesture so familiar it hurt. Now, show me your report card. I've been waiting all month to see it. Ngozi's grades were excellent. Top of her class in mathematics, second in English, high marks in everything else. Adora held the report card in her cracked, damaged hands and felt something surge through her that was bigger than exhaustion, bigger than pain, a fierce, burning pride that made all of it, every pre-dawn morning and every back-breaking afternoon, feel suddenly bearable. She had done this, her sacrifice had purchased this. These grades, this future, this chance at something better, it was built on her back. And for one perfect moment, standing in Mama Nkechi's compound with her sister's results in her hands, Adora felt wealthy in a way that had nothing to do with money. That night, after Ngozi fell asleep on the mat beside her, Adora sat up in the darkness counting the money in her tin by feel, her fingers knowing the texture of each naira note, calculating whether she had enough for next term's fees, for new textbooks, for the small things Ngozi would need. The numbers were tight. The numbers were always tight, but they would work. She would make them work. She always did.
The bus to Lagos left from Onitsha at dawn, and Ngozi sat by the window with her small metal box on her lap and a feeling in her chest that she couldn't quite name. Part excitement, part terror, all of it enormous. She was 18 years old and she had passed her WAEC examinations with grades that made her teachers shake their heads in wonder. And now she was going to university, something that seemed as impossible and distant as the moon until the acceptance letter had arrived with her name printed on official paper. Adora had sold the last of their mother's jewelry to pay the acceptance fee. She'd worked extra Sundays for 2 months to save enough for the bus fare and the first month's hostel fees. The morning Ngozi left, her sister had pressed a small envelope into her hands, 2,000 naira, carefully folded, representing weeks of 4 a.m. mornings and cracked hands and meals skipped. For emergencies, Adora had said, her voice steady, even though her eyes were wet. Don't spend it unless you truly need it. I'll send more next month. Ngozi had wanted to refuse it, wanted to say that Adora had already given too much, but the words stuck in her throat because they both knew she would need it, knew that pride was a luxury neither of them could afford. So she'd taken the envelope and held her sister tight and whispered, I'll make you proud, Ada, I promise. And Adora had smiled that smile, the one that said, you already do, and stood waving until the bus turned the corner and Omoa had disappeared behind the red dust. Lagos announced itself long before Ngozi could see it, the traffic thickening like blood in a vein, the smell changing from earth and palm trees to something else entirely, something sharp and chemical and alive with possibility. When the bus finally crawled into the motor park at Ojota, she stepped down into noise that was physical, that pressed against her eardrums and vibrated in her chest. Yellow Danfo buses swerved and honked, conductors hung from doorways shouting destinations in a rapid-fire pidgin she could barely understand. Hawkers pushed past with impossible loads balanced on their heads, plantain chips, phone chargers, iced water in plastic bags, shoes, bread, live chickens, DVDs of American movies she'd never heard of. The air tasted like exhaust and salt water and a million people's sweat mixing in the heat. A taxi driver quoted her a price to the university campus that would have taken a quarter of Adora's envelope. So she asked 3 more until she found one willing to take her for 800 naira. The city unfolded around her through the taxi window like a fever dream. Bridges stacked on top of bridges, buildings that climbed into the clouds, billboards advertising things she didn't know existed, women in clothes so expensive they looked like costumes, men in cars that cost more than every house in Omoa combined. This was Lagos. This was the place people came to become something, or to disappear trying. The university campus was its own city within the city. Gates and security and buildings that looked like they belonged in the magazines her secondary school library used to receive 6 months late. Her hostel was a 3-story block of rooms where 8 girls shared a space meant for 4, with bunk beds pushed so close together you had to turn sideways to walk between them. Her roommates were already there, arranging their things when she arrived with her small box and her village dust still on her sandals. There was Kemi from Lagos, who had a suitcase the size of a coffin and was hanging designer clothes on hangers with the tag still attached. There was Blessing from Port Harcourt, whose father owned oil wells and who had brought her own small refrigerator, a refrigerator in a hostel room that hummed constantly in the corner. There was Amarachi from Enugu, whose mother was a professor and who spoke English with an accent that made even simple words sound expensive. They were nice enough. They said welcome and what's your name and helped her find an empty bunk. But Ngozi felt it immediately, like a cold draft. She was different. Her box was smaller. Her clothes were fewer. Her sandals were from Onitsha Market, not the boutiques in Victoria Island. When they asked what her parents did and she said quietly that her parents were late, they made sympathetic sounds, but their eyes did something else. A quick calculation, a subtle repositioning. She was not their kind. She would have to work harder to belong here. The first month was disorienting in a way she hadn't expected. The lectures were fine, she was smart, she could follow the material, she'd always been good with books. But the university existed on 2 levels, and only one of them happened in classrooms. There was the official curriculum of textbooks and assignments and exams, and then there was the other education. Which club to join, which lecturer to avoid, which parties mattered, which restaurants served the best small chops, who was dating whom, who had money and who was pretending. Her roommates navigated this second curriculum with the ease of people who'd been training for it their entire lives. They knew how to dress, how to talk, how to laugh at jokes Ngozi didn't understand. They went out on Fridays to places with names like Escape and Kilox, came back at 3 a.m. with stories about men who bought bottles of champagne just to spray them on the floor. Ngozi stayed in the hostel those nights, eating gari that she'd brought from home, telling herself she was there to study, not to party. But there were moments, lying in her bunk bed while her roommates got ready, watching them line their eyes and gloss their legs and spray perfume that probably cost more than a term's feeding money, when she felt something small and bitter growing in her chest. Not jealousy exactly, something closer to humiliation, the shame of being the poor girl, the village girl, the one who couldn't afford to belong. She called Adora every Sunday from a call center near campus, feeding coins into a slot while her sister's voice crackled through a bad connection. How are your studies? Are you eating well? Do you need anything? And Ngozi would lie, small lies, protective lies, and say everything was fine. The hostel was comfortable. She had everything she needed. She didn't mention that everything meant 1 pair of good shoes that she rotated carefully, that her roommate had more clothes than she'd seen in her entire life, that she'd started skipping meals to make her feeding money stretch further. She didn't mention the weight of being surrounded by abundance while carrying scarcity in her bones. She especially didn't mention the men. They were everywhere on campus. Older men, men with cars, men who seemed to orbit the campus gate like sharks suckling fish. They offered rides, they offered lunch, they offered to help with textbooks, with phone credit, with small things that didn't seem like much until you realize how many small things you needed. Most of the girls said no at first, but Ngozi noticed how many of them eventually said yes. How Blessing's refrigerator stayed full because of a family friend who visited her on Thursdays. How Kemi's new laptop had appeared after a weekend trip to Abuja with someone she called
uncle. Nobody talked about it directly, but everybody understood the economics. This was how you survived Lagos if you were pretty and young and didn't have a father's money catching you when you fell. She met Chief Emeka Nwosu at the end of her second semester at a small restaurant near campus where she'd gone with Amarachi to celebrate the end of exams. She'd ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, jollof rice and chicken, no extras, when she noticed the man at the table across from them. He was older, maybe 55, wearing a traditional agbada that looked like it cost more than Mama Nkechi's entire compound. He had the particular confidence of a man who'd never been told no. The way he sat, the way he gestured to the waiter, the way his eyes moved around the room like he was taking inventory of everything he might want. His eyes landed on Ngozi and stayed there, not in a crude way, more like appraisal, like he was calculating her value, her potential, her price. He sent over drinks first, Chapman, sweet and cold. Then he came to the table himself, introduced himself as a businessman, and asked polite questions about their studies with the kind of false interest rich men use when they want something. Amarachi, who had seen this dance before, made an excuse and left. Ngozi stayed. She told herself she was just being polite, just finishing her drink. But when Chief Emeka Nwosu asked for her number, promising to help her with textbooks for next semester, she gave it to him. She told herself it was harmless. Everyone did this. She'd seen it 100 times. And besides, she thought as she walked back to the hostel that evening with her business card in her pocket, what exactly would be wrong with accepting a little help? She'd been carrying everything alone for so long. Her sister was carrying everything. Maybe it was her turn to be carried, just a little, just until she found her footing. That's what she told herself. That night, lying in her bunk bed while her roommate slept, she looked at the business card, gold lettering on expensive paper, and allowed herself for just a moment to imagine what it might feel like to stop struggling, to stop counting every naira, to stop being the poor girl who didn't belong. The thought was so sweet, it almost hurt.
Adora had been saving the transport money for 3 months, setting aside 50 naira here, 100 there, sometimes just 20 when the week had been particularly lean. She kept it in a separate envelope, hidden inside her mother's old Bible at the back of Mama Nkechi's cupboard. And every time she added to it, she would whisper to herself, "Soon, soon I'll see her." She hadn't told Ngozi she was coming. She wanted it to be a surprise, wanted to see her sister's face light up the way it used to when they were children, and Adora would bring home something special from the market. She'd cooked jollof rice the night before, the good kind with plenty of chicken and the right amount of pepper, and wrapped it carefully in layers of foil so it would stay warm on the journey. She'd bought a piece of Ankara fabric at the market, not expensive but beautiful, deep blue with yellow patterns that would look stunning on Ngozi, and folded it with the same care their mother used to use when preparing gifts. The morning she left, Mama Nkechi had looked at her with those ancient knowing eyes and said, "Be careful, my child. Lagos is not like Omoa. People change in big cities." Adara had laughed it off, kissed her grandmother's papery cheek and said, "Mama, it's just Ngozi. She doesn't change." But now, sitting in the bus as it crawled through Lagos traffic, watching the city rise around her like a wall of glass and concrete, an impossible wealth, she felt the first cold finger of doubt touch the back of her neck. The address had been difficult to get. Ngozi's phone was often off these days, or she didn't answer, or when she did answer, she sounded distracted, distant, like she was talking from somewhere very far away. When Adara finally reached her last week, she'd asked casually about the hostel, about whether she was comfortable there, and Ngozi had said quickly, too quickly, "Yes, fine, everything's fine." But then her roommate had called Adara back later, a girl named Amarachi with a kind voice, and said quietly, "Sister, your sister is not staying in the hostel anymore. I'm not supposed to tell you, but I think you should know. This is where she's living now." She'd given Adara an address in Lekki and the name of an estate, and Adara had written it down with hands that had suddenly started shaking. Lekki. Even in Omoa had it heard of Lekki, where the rich people lived, where the houses had swimming pools and generators that never stopped running, and security gates that kept out everyone who didn't belong. Why would Ngozi be living in Lekki?
She tried to push the question away, tried to imagine reasonable explanations. Maybe she'd found a good family to work for. Maybe someone from church was helping her. Maybe there was a scholarship she hadn't mentioned. But the doubt was there now, cold and heavy in her stomach, growing with every kilometer that brought her closer to Lagos.